That car, my God. Like that. My first impression was like, what the hell have they done? But then I saw that picture of the Cybertruck with the Hypershock paint scheme. And honestly, that looks so incredible. Like that I was like, oh my God, that looks amazing. So I think we should preface this recording by admitting that this is the second attempt to record this episode, and we're covering much the same topics as we've tried to do once before. So some of this conversation might seem a bit odd and weird, and that's because having the same conversation twice within a week is inherently weird.
Something that we've always tried to do, I think at my insistence, is avoid having any conversations at all about anything we might talk about in an episode. So there were a lot of times, for example, when we were building Hello There, where we'd be building over a weekend, and we'd both have watched BattleBots, but we would not allow ourselves to talk about it at all for fear of ruining the next recording. I'm very sensitive to this, so we'll see how we go. We've got some fun topics, some fun new topics that we've added. That makes me feel good.
Yeah.
You already hate me for mentioning that.
If people want to know what's coming up in the episode, they should look at the show notes.
You mean I can't do a fun intro?
No, but you can tell me about Battle in the Berg.
Battle in the Borough, absolutely. This was an incredible live event, which would have been incredible no matter what, because it was a great field and a really well-run tournament, really well-streamed. That already was enough. But then we had the tale of Dwayne Nibley. Dwayne Nibley is a robot that needs a bit of explanation. If you remember Bucky, the heavyweight, it's kind of a Beetleweight version of that. And it's a robot that I think we both first saw during Bogglebots filming, not in person, but it was either a photo of the finished or half-finished robot, or maybe even just a CAD at that point. And I immediately fell in love with it. Because I like silly robots and I like Red Dwarf. It's pretty much the perfect storm of robots Ryan will love. And it turns out it's also an incredibly effective wedge, which just flew through this competition with almost disgusting ease at points, culminating in that magnificent final against Daedalus. And I don't think I have ever been happier watching a live stream. And I don't think I've ever seen such an incredible reaction from a crowd to a fight. The whole thing is glorious and beautiful. It's all up on YouTube in a kind of Bogglebots-esque heat format, and every single person who has not already done so should go and watch it, because it was excellent.
It's funny hearing you talk about these like live events and live streams, because you always talk about it and I feel like I've missed out on something, because shockingly I didn't watch this. I have seen the fights or some of the fights since, but I didn't watch it live. And I always sort of, you talk about it, you were tweeting about it, I thought, oh man, I feel like I'm missing out on something. But every time I click on a link to watch a live stream of one of these things, I feel like every time I do it, I click on and there's nothing happening whenever I'm watching. And I'm just not really the kind of person to throw something on in the background and leave it there. Like, I'm sort of actively watching one thing. And so, yeah, live streams aren't for me. So I didn't see it live. But the final was pretty incredible. That was a great fight and a fantastic demonstration of what janky-looking robots can do.
I think live streams of events are the kind of equivalent to test match cricket.
Yes, I know what that is.
I don't know if that's sarcastic or not.
I don't even know what you mean by test match cricket. Is that different to normal cricket? Like this is.
So test match cricket is the cricket equivalent of a live event.
Brilliant.
So no, test match cricket is kind of the long, slow form of cricket where it takes place over 5 days.
My God.
And obviously, these players are playing for 5 days. Okay, they're not always out, but they're not exactly giving everything all the time. There are slow periods. It's kind of about wearing a team down rather than attacking them as hard as you can. So they're trying to get through sort of 90 to 100 overs. So that's almost 600 balls in a day. 600 throws of the ball at the sticks.
Okay.
because I've now just assumed you know nothing about cricket.
That's a safe assumption. I can cope with this now. 600 throwings of a ball at some sticks.
And that's in a day. So things are slow going. And if you listen to radio commentary of one of these things, most of it is just them talking about anything they can that isn't what's happening out on the field. It's basically a day-long podcast structured around an occasional wicket.
Wow.
And people who enjoy Test match cricket, and I am one of them, first of all, you have to enjoy all of that bollocks. You have to enjoy the conversation that's going on around it. And you have to be invested enough in the big moments to put up with the downtime. And for me, something like Battle in the Borough, the big moments of Dwayne Nibley winning are absolutely worth the downtime between fights. But it's very much an acquired taste. And I think you also kind of, rather than necessarily enjoying a load of commentary around it, you're enjoying the conversation that you're having with people about it as you go in the chat or on Discord or wherever. It's a very specific type of enjoyment that you don't expect to be for everyone. But in this case, they've made it incredibly easy to catch up without going through that. Most live events don't bother editing everything together into a really digestible format. But in this case, they have. And that is a beautiful thing.
What are you doing then when you're watching one of these live things? Are you doing other things, or are you just sat there in front of your computer or phone or whatever on the chat for the whole day?
It's a mix of things.
Not that there's anything wrong with any of this. I'm just curious to know what you do with the time when there's not a fight happening.
So with this particular event, because things were moving at a pretty good pace and because there was quite a lot of chat between fights, I was focused on it fairly well. There was a period during the day where I was doing football club stuff, so I was kind of following that on Twitter and doing some graphics work while listening in and kind of focusing in when I knew a fight was happening. If you take an event like I was watching this weekend as we record, Norwalk Havoc, that's something that I was only focusing on for the fights, because all the stuff in between was just replays of the same fight, which is a good way to fill time, but not particularly interesting to me. There wasn't really much going on in the chat, and also it wasn't a bunch of builders that I knew, so I wasn't as invested in the conversation that was going on around it. I wasn't as interested in watching people mill around the arena, which was something that was quite fun with Battle in the Borough. So it really varies, but I wouldn't say that I'm ever sitting down for a whole day of looking at the same screen without touching my phone or thinking about other things.
Because I tried to watch that, I've already forgotten it was called, but that live thing that happened this weekend.
Norwalk Havoc, yeah.
That one, yeah. So I tried sort of like tuning in for a couple of fights in that, and I watched one fight, and I thought, well, I'll leave that on, and then the next time I hear a fight start, I'll come back and I'll watch that. I thought I will try my hardest to engage with this in some way. And so I started sort of doing something else, and I was fiddling with some programming stuff. And I think I just missed two fights. And it's like, oh, okay, right. Clearly I'm not listening enough to know when the fight starts. And I just gave up and closed it. So yeah, it's just not, I don't know, live streams just don't do it for me with anything. I want to watch them because exciting things seem to happen in them. Always miss it. But you know, I tried.
I feel like you're not someone that gets much from the feeling of, I was there and I saw it live. You're someone who is happy to wait a couple of days and then see the thing in the convenient way. And that's absolutely fine.
There are something, because I did sort of make a point of watching a lot of significant SpaceX launches live. I even, to the point that I would get up at stupid o'clock in the morning to try and watch some of them. When they were like first developing the landing stuff, because well, I want to watch that and experience it. And I think I did see the first time they landed a booster. I did see that live, and that was cool. And I think there is something different about that versus just seeing a recording of it the next day. But I guess the difference there is that those live streams are like an hour long maybe versus a whole day. And even then, like I don't tune in for the whole live stream. I sort of know when the launch. This is one of those things where you know the exact time the launch is going to happen generally, and so I sort of like tune in like 5 minutes before or something.
And also with that, you know what you're going to get.
Yeah.
You know that you are tuning in to see this thing done, hopefully for the first time.
Yeah, I guess there is that more guaranteed payoff of a potentially historic event.
And it's one of those things where if you did miss it, you could beat yourself up about it because that's so avoidable. Whereas I would have been a little bit upset if I hadn't got to see... Well, actually, I didn't get to see the final of this event live. I was actually distracted doing something else with family. But I was noticing my phone constantly go off as it happened, and that was basically good enough. But if I had missed the whole thing, I would have been a little bit annoyed to have missed it, but it would be kind of, well, what could I do? Who was going to see that coming? If I'd had the opportunity to actually be there and not been, that would have been a very different thing, though. Although I'm sure the same applies if you had the chance to be at a SpaceX launch.
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking if I went to one of these live combat robot events, sort of like went there in the audience, I think I would be more engaged because you just naturally are when you're there.
You know, I don't actually know what I'd be like at an event live.
No.
I don't know if I might struggle with that.
I think I'd probably get restless between, because I think there would be obviously some period of downtime. And I think it depends how it is, because obviously the Bugglebots filming has Bob entertaining the audience in the meantime, and that's quite good, I think. I don't know if there's an equivalent of that for other live events. I think if you didn't have that, I think I'd probably get pretty bored between the fights.
I think when we did Euros, we both kind of struggled to just sit and watch fights, didn't we?
Yeah, I mean, so that was interesting because obviously for a lot of the time we had stuff to do. So like we did a fight and then we went and did our own thing. Like we went obviously repairing our own robot, and then we did come out and watch a couple of fights. And I think that improved when I don't know who it was, whoever the guy that picked up a microphone at some point and started playing MC. That was good. I thought like that made
yes.
That made everything a bit better. Just having someone kind of presenting it definitely helps.
Which is what you had at Battle in the Borough as well with Suv, who is absolutely excellent with that. He's like Bob level with that.
I think that's what you need. So I think I'd be more interested if I was there in person. And like I said, there's definitely value in being somewhere in person, because like I really enjoyed watching ice hockey when I was at uni, like going to the rink and like watching it there, but like I'd never watch it on television or anything. Like I'm not interested enough in the sport, but the actual experience of being there in the place with all the other people sort of screaming and cheering and all that kind of stuff, it's really that's pretty cool. So I think there'd be the same kind of effect being there in person. But yeah, I don't know, live streams not for me. I'm glad they exist though. I'm glad other people enjoy them.
And again, to plug it for the final time, in this case you don't even need the live stream because they've put it all together into a great set of videos. Link in show notes. Plug complete.
So proud.
I'm now just trying to imagine you at a sport event going mad.
Oh, it was. I genuinely really enjoyed going to those ice hockey games because I went to uni in Coventry, and Coventry has a big like skate rink and I don't know, skate rink, ice rink, I don't know, and a team and stuff. And Warwick has a team as well, and so there's a lot of competition between those two universities, and that's exciting. So it was good, it was sort of like good because it's like, well, I have a team that I can support. Like it makes sense to support Coventry in that case. I forget what the team's called now. It's ridiculous, but like, and going there, and you go in there with like a bunch of mates, and the atmosphere is it carries you along, and it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed doing it.
Now you mention it, I think that's another thing that was a bit different for me with Battle in the Borough, that I actually had a specific robot to support. Obviously, I want everyone to do well, but I particularly wanted Dwayne Nibley to do well, which started off being a meme and ended up being a genuine dream. That does make a big difference too. So even I will happily watch football, but I find it hard to watch football on TV if it's not a team I support.
Yeah, see, I bet I would enjoy like going to a football match properly, like actually going to one and watching it. I think I'd enjoy that far more than I'd never sit and watch it on television. But again, I think being there adds a lot.
There's one thing I can guarantee you will never enjoy Test match cricket.
That sounds accurate.
Well, on that uncontroversial note, I want to talk about something that's been... I don't know if it's been annoying me, but it's something that, with it being the off-season from BattleBots in particular, seems to be part of the conversation again, and I just want to talk about why I think it's terrible. And that is the constant flow of suggestions to address the dominance of spinners in the kind of heavyweight sphere. Now, I am the first to talk about how I would like to see more non-spinners doing well, or non-spinners being represented. I want to see people keep building them. But there's this very prevalent idea that it's something we somehow need to fix. And the suggestion that's come up again is this idea of giving weight bonuses to non-spinners.
I bet that can't be abused.
If only there were some cases in history of weight bonuses proving to be massively overpowered. Now, I've made my position rather clear. I feel like you share it as well, but I'd like your immediate reaction to this idea.
So I think it's something you just sort of alluded to was the idea, was questioning whether or not this is something that even needs to be fixed. You know, is this a problem that needs fixing, the sort of dominance of spinners in these competitions? And I don't know. I wonder if just having competitions where spinners aren't allowed is the way to go with that. But
So you mean basically the sportsman classes?
Yeah. But yeah, I think that weight bonuses to robots without spinners is not the answer.
I think we kind of have to approach this from an angle of, let's just accept that there's a problem and approach it as a hypothetical to fix that perceived problem, which this just absolutely does not do. Because all you're doing is devaluing the success that any non-spinner might then have. The moment someone comes in with their weight bonus and sweeps the floor with all the big bad spinners, what's the response going to be? Oh yeah, you only won because of the weight bonus. Wasn't a fair fight. You had an advantage.
Well, so before we even go into that kind of stuff, like I just want to question whether or not even having more weight would even meaningfully solve this. Like, how much more weight would you need to meaningfully level that field? Because like spinners, I guess you could have more. I don't know. Like, I just feel like spinners can win through internal damage, and like, I feel like weight is not necessarily going to be the. I don't know. How much are people suggesting in bonus? Like 50%, 100%, 20%? Like, what are we talking here?
You honestly think the people making these suggestions have thought about implementation?
Well,
just some weight, Sam. That's all they need. Just give them some.
If they haven't thought of a specific weight allowance, then what's the point in even discussing it?
I mean, even if they have thought of a specific weight allowance, that's going to be completely arbitrary anyway. Weight bonuses are something that we're used to in terms of walkers and shufflers. And I have no idea how people decided on those weight bonuses. I'm guessing they thought of a number and then adjusted it over time.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's worth pointing out, you sort of said if someone chose a number, it would be arbitrary. Every number in this is arbitrary. I think.
Absolutely.
Like these are all numbers plucked out of thin air. Whatever the weight bonus is for walkers and stuff, by the way, I don't think it's enough because no one builds walkers.
Well, in BattleBots, they're currently not offering any bonuses for walkers or shufflers.
Oh, well, that'd be why no one does it then.
Which I think is the correct approach for a competition like BattleBots. When it comes to smaller weight classes, I like the fact that those bonuses are available, because it does encourage people to do it occasionally. I think the bigger barrier, particularly in UK amp weights, to making a walker or shuffler is size limits. Although the size limit is a barrier to everything fun, and that's why I don't like it. But even then, in beetle weights, I believe, and I really should have fact-checked this before, I know there was a discussion going on about abolishing weight bonuses or reducing them, and I think that is what ended up happening. And it's kind of a different discussion in a way with BattleBots in particular, because anybody that builds a robot for BattleBots is essentially making a charitable donation to Discovery. They are spending their own money to give Discovery content. And if you're someone who is interested in winning, that does probably mean you're going to go down one of two or three very specific routes to try and do that. But most people aren't in it expecting to win anyway. Most people are in it to build a robot that they love and maybe prove that it can be better than people expect. So I don't really believe that even offering a bonus like this would suddenly make people flock to these designs. And if it did, people would hate that too. Sort of, oh no, all these heavy non-spinners dominating the competition. We need to do something to give the spinners a boost.
This all seems to be predicated on the idea that the outcome should be a fairly even distribution of weapon types winning. I think that sort of feels like what people are looking for. But then that's not a competition anymore. You may as well be playing Retunti without any kind of weighting. It just becomes a random distribution, and I question what the point of that is. Like, I think if you've got a competition, a logical consequence of that is that particular approaches are going to win more often than others, right? Like, you're going to have, like, you know, in sporting things, like, do you try and do something to try and deal with the more skilled players? Like, I don't know. It just seems like a silly. I feel like this is one of the things where my opinion has probably changed. I think I've probably gone from, spinners are a big problem and we should try and find ways to deal with them, to they're a logical outcome of the competition, and there's not much that can be done that doesn't have all other kind of silly side effects. Like, I think, like you said, having a weight bonus for non-spinners, I just think means that you're either going to end up with a random distribution of people winning, which seems silly to me. Like, that's not competition at that point, or you're going to have the heavier robots dominating, which I think is quite a likely outcome given past events. And then then you said it just becomes a circular thing of, well, now we've got to deal with the weight bonus, and what do you do? Do you increase the limit for the kinetic energy in a spinner at that point to try and combat that? Like, I don't know.
I'm sympathetic to the viewpoint. I was one of the people when we got to the final 16 going, isn't it a shame that we've only got X number of non-spinners here? I really hope that a few of them go through. But that's, if anything, due to a frustration that I have where I feel that the rules of BattleBots as they are written take the dominant weapon type, which is spinners, and give them even more advantages. So that is something that I don't like. That is something I would reverse, and I've got a lot of ideas of how you would do that. But that's very different to then going, okay, we're going to directly buff the other stuff. You know, BattleBots, in terms of its arena and its judging rules, it seems very intentionally skewed towards highly damaging designs because that's what makes spectacular TV. And as someone who's a bit more of a purist with the sport, you do not necessarily want there to be this even distribution of designs represented at the top of major tournaments, but you do want to feel that everyone has a reasonable chance of winning if they are sufficiently skilled. And in BattleBots, I don't think that's quite the case. I think to win with a non-spinner, you would have to be noticeably more skilled or noticeably more lucky than your peers. You know, I don't believe, as brilliant as he is, that Paul Ventimiglia would come in with a hammer and still win. Because there are a set of... First of all, a natural set of advantages for spinners, absolutely, but also an artificial set that are piled on top of that. That's my issue with BattleBots particularly. I feel like I may have changed viewpoint about 3 times during that, which is completely out of character. But weight bonuses are not the answer at all. You don't level a playing field by putting another bump in it.
Yeah, I think there's an argument to be made to have the rules be simpler. Like, I think you want to try and reduce caveats in rules, because then you've got, like, oh, you can weigh this much unless you've got this weapon type, in which case you can only weigh this much. See, it's harder to explain than the weight limit is this, you know? Like, the weight limit is 100 kilograms is much easier than the weight limit is 100 unless you're not a spinner, in which case it's 150, like that.
And then we've got to define what a spinner is and decide where you fit, if you're Whiplash or Mammoth or Sawblaze. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Yeah, like, what do you do if you've got, like, a tiny spinner? The
whole meta ends up revolving around making a spinner small enough that it doesn't get classified as a spinner.
Yeah, exactly. You want a kinetic energy weapon that that sidesteps these rules, so that you've got... Because that's what... Was it like a Son of Waiachi did that at some point, was it? Where it was a shuffler, so it had like a huge weight bonus and then just had this ridiculous spinner. Is that right?
Yeah. It was basically a super heavyweight in the heavyweight class.
Yeah, and that was insane. And I feel like the same thing would happen again if you did that. Whereas if you... Because I don't think it would be fair to give someone like Whiplash to not give... Because they're not primarily a spinner, you know? So it's... yeah, you're right. Like, how do you... You're not having to define spinners and at what point you don't give them a weight bonus. Plus the idea of like phrasing it as a weight bonus for a non-spinner really cements the idea that a spinner is the default. So maybe you would want to phrase it as a like a penalty if you build a spinner, is that you have a weight reduction.
We're going to increase the whole weight limit and then penalise spinners.
Exactly, yeah.
It's totally different, guys. It's totally different.
Well, I think that that's more honest to what is actually the idea here, but also it's I don't know, it's a distinction in linguistics that I think is important, because the idea is not, because if you say you've got a bonus for other things, it means that the default is the thing that's not got the bonus, and I think that what people want is to not have spinners be the default. So I think you need to word it to reflect that, but that's a separate point. Surely
the most neutral thing to do is have a weight limit and offer non-spinners an amount above it, and offer spinners penalise spinners by the same amount to go below it. That's the true neutral.
No, the true neutral is a weight limit, and that's it. No caveats. It's like your robots can weigh up to 100 kilograms, and that's the end of it.
What do you think can be done, thinking specifically about BattleBots, and assuming that, if nothing else, my framing of the problem is actually a problem? Because I always like it when people assume I'm right. What do we do to create a more level playing field where you do feel like the hammers and the control bots and the flippers have a genuine chance of going quite far?
The thing is, I don't think you can. I think that's a goal that is unreachable, because the primary way to win in robot combat is to disable your opponent. And clearly the most effective way to do that is to store and then deliver an insane amount of energy like that. And what's the most effective way of doing that? I think it's fairly clearly some kind of spinner. Unless there's some huge advance in like mechanisms for firing axes. And so I don't know really that you necessarily can achieve a genuine level playing field there. I think that spinners will always have an advantage. The obvious one is to allow wedges, but obviously I don't think they're going to do that, because Discovery don't feel, or whoever, BattleBots don't feel that is as entertaining. And then you made a point about you think the rules give advantages to spinners, but like I feel like that's only in the case of judges' decisions, and I don't know how many judges' decisions are actually. I don't know how many fights with spinners actually go to a judge's decision versus just the spinner knocking the opponent out.
Judging is certainly the area that I feel the advantage is given most strongly to spinners. But also in terms of the arena design, because everything you've said about the best way to win is to smash your opponent into small pieces by storing lots of energy is true in a featureless box. But BattleBots doesn't have to be a featureless box. I enjoyed that at RoboGames. That was different with RoboGames, because I was watching lots of Robot Wars at the time, and they were complete opposites. And I think it's easy and tempting to think of BattleBots as sitting in the middle of those things. But it's way more towards the RoboGames end of the scale, realistically. If you have an arena with a pit and big sort of ring-out zones, suddenly storing lots of energy isn't the only meaningful way to win a fight. It gives control bots in particular a very realistic route to victory. As does sort of having more damaging hazards. If you had bigger, heavier, more powerful versions of the pulverizers, if you have... I think the saws are limited in their effectiveness anyway. But different versions of that, different versions of the screws that are more likely to end a fight, is a way of doing that. People won't like it. People won't like it at all, and they might even be the same people that claim there's a problem currently. But if it's a problem that you believe exists and you are committed to solving, to me, arena design is the first port of call. Because what you're doing is you're creating an environment that applies to everyone, and everyone can utilise, and everyone can be harmed by.
That's interesting, because I guess if you have a lot of kinetic energy stored, that becomes an advantage in terms of attacking, but it also becomes a disadvantage when you lose control. Obviously, if you start pinballing around the arena and there's an open pit, then that's a problem.
Although you're equally able to whack someone into a pit with your spinner, potentially. So it's not like it directly nerfs that one design.
No, it is. But my point is, it is interesting in that I think that does kind of level things in many ways, because it adds yeah, like it adds things fairly evenly. But I think it is a particular risk for particularly unstable spinners and stuff. It's tricky though because I think that if the arena starts winning fights, I think I would wonder if that would be seen as less entertaining for most people. I think I think it'd be really hard to find like a set of arena hazards that are difficult to accidentally come afoul of, and that require some skill from one of the competitors to put the other one into them, if that makes sense. Like, you want a pit that is hard but not impossible to accidentally fall into, and that requires some amount of skill for the control bot to put them in there, maybe. I don't know. Because then at least you can sort of say, well, the control bot, they won that fight, and it took some skill to do it, rather than, there was a big open hole that they could fairly trivially put them into. I don't know.
I don't think you would ever sell BattleBots fans on a pit. A pit is something that is only really accepted in the UK. There are a few insect class live events in America that use pits, and I think builders and competitors are fine with that, but the BattleBots TV audience, they would share the view that you've kind of, I hope almost accidentally had there, of the arena is winning the fight. Which I don't think is true. I think most of the time, I suppose, I was going to use the Dwayne Nibley versus Daedalus example, but that was Daedalus cannoning off of a wall and going in. But there are certainly ways to design an arena with a pit that it is highly unlikely someone will go into accidentally. You put it against a sidewall, or maybe even recessed into a sidewall, something like that. Kind of like the middle pocket of a snooker table, I'm thinking. That kind of thing, you're very unlikely to go in by accident. If you do, you can genuinely say it was unlucky, but it is something that an opponent can still use. But even so, because with BattleBots in particular, a lot of people have got used to this idea of it's 1v1, best robot wins, spinner wins. The idea of a fight-ending hazard will immediately get people screaming bullshit. Possibly literally live in a crowd, because I know what American sport event crowds can be like.
I think there is an attraction to the sport being a battle of strength. I think that is appealing, of having robots where the primary way of winning is destruction of the opponent. I think that's the appealing thing, and the reason that BattleBots is structured the way that it is, in that there are these hazards around the place that just kind of liven things up a little bit, but they don't really do damage, such that there's a lot of this in principle, and they encourage a lot of destruction between the robots, and it's kind of like, like fight to the death kind of stuff. And I think there's a lot of appeal to that. And I think when you start introducing things like, recessed pits or other hazards that I can't think of right now that require some level of skill to use, when it becomes a battle of skill, that is less appealing in some ways. I think it depends on how much, like, it's more appealing in terms of analysis, like of sort of really getting into the sport and the strategy and all that kind of stuff, but it sort of loses a certain amount of spectacle. And I don't know if BattleBots would ever do that.
I think it's only problematic if you're used to something different. We, as young Robot Combat fans, grew up with the idea of house robots and a pit, and a very low wall. So to us, that is the default, and that is fine. In recent years, because of things like Robo Games and BattleBots, I kind of went off the idea of a pit for a while, until I was at a live event and saw how excited people get by the pit, or how excited a UK audience gets by the pit. And again, I'm going to bring it up. The Dwayne Nibley versus Daedalus fight is amazing, because that moment of Daedalus going down the pit is an ending. It is a thing that everyone could get up and cheer about. It is the equivalent to a goal in football. Whereas in BattleBots, unless someone gets put out of the arena, in fact, even when someone gets put out of the arena, technically, you've got a count out. And when that ends, it's kind of a euphoric moment, but it's also a kind of inevitable, drawn-out march towards the end. There isn't that big moment of, holy crap, that just happened. And the pit does give you that, if you're willing to embrace it. But we all know that it will not be embraced by BattleBots. And for the record, I'm fine with that. That is the robot combat culture of the US. That's fine.
Yeah, I think that's the way the BattleBots is. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with it either. I think that possibly the real solution maybe is just more variety in competitions, in having other competitions that put weight on different things, in, you know, either competitions that don't allow spinners, or competitions that have different arena designs that prioritize skillful wins over brute force wins and stuff like that. I think there's a lot of scope for variations on the theme, and I don't think we necessarily need to go and change what BattleBots currently is and represents. I think there's room to have more of them.
I agree with that from the point of view of a competitor and a fanatic, in terms of, if we can have lots of different ways to play, I'm satisfied. But if you're a TV viewer, BattleBots is all you have.
There's enough there's enough room, I think, for other ideas here, because I think that what BattleBots is the commercially successful version of this, with the big spectacle and the big destruction. I think, like I said, I think there's an appeal to that you lose with the more skillful wins, or the more sort of the more skill-based sort of competitions there. But also, you know, in the land of a million streaming services and a million channels on cable or satellite TV or whatever, then there's, you know, you could have Netflix have their own one, and Amazon Prime have another one, and, you know, whoever else in the US have all their things, and maybe Disney brings out one that's got fluffy robots that don't hurt each other, and you know,
and that aren't allowed to be put on merchandise together.
And so you've got all this kind of, I think there's so much scope for it, and like, it's astonishing if you think about how much sort of like entertainment stuff exists. Like, I think that's how much television is currently produced across, just in America, just for American stuff. It's insane how many channels there are, how many shows come out, all the streaming services. It's amazing. And so it stands, I think that there is room for other televised things that are not BattleBots. And I suspect that BattleBots would continue to be the most popular of them, because it's got the mind share, and because I think it's got a certain amount of just raw appeal in the destruction. But I think that there is room for these other competitions, for the fanatics like us to go and watch and enjoy. But I think for sort of the closest this gets to a mainstream entertainment, I think is probably going to be the most destructive one.
And that makes me so sad.
Yeah, but at this point you're sort of complaining about the way that humanity is and stuff, and it's like, well, that's a different thing. A weight bonus isn't going to change that.
No, it just feels like we have an opportunity to, done correctly, we can take these people who just want Big Smash and show them how much more there is. And BattleBots currently doesn't do that.
I think there's nothing wrong with just wanting Big Smash. I mean, that's predominantly what I want. So, like, you know, while I do appreciate the sort of the more skillful wins, you know, this is one of the sort of design goals of our robots is, you know, withstand Big Smash, because it's entertaining, because I enjoy it as well. And so, like, you know, I think there's nothing wrong with that being the mainstream at all. Like I said, I think there's room for their stuff to be these additive things. I don't think you need to change BattleBots.
I think we can summarise my frustration with the simple fact that Wan Hu versus Shatter wasn't most people's favourite fight of the season, and it damn well should have been. Although I suppose that was a form of Big Smash anyway.
It was Big Smash.
I feel like I now need to crowbar things back a little bit, just so I can soapbox a little bit more about judging criteria.
You and your judging criteria, man. Like, shockingly, the two British people have spent ages talking about a pit in BattleBots, and now, shockingly, Ryan is going to talk about judging criteria.
Probably quite inconsistently as well. I've been saying for a long time that I want judging criteria which favour spinners less. Because, in my opinion, if a spinner takes a fight to a judge's decision, it has already failed. The whole idea of a spinner is to score a big destructive KO quickly, and if they don't do that, I see that as them being on the back foot. Whereas currently, a spinner that has essentially failed to do its job will still usually get the decision because of the way the rules are written. And I've got some simple ways of aggressing that. You can tell what I'm about to talk about. Addressing that. Number one, stop penalising wedging in terms of aggression. Wedging is an attack. Deal with it. Then you need to give control bots, or just generally less damaging designs, meaningful ways to score damage points. So number 1, do what I think robo games used to do, count inverting an opponent as a form of damage. If you're against, say, Bite Force and you manage to get them upside down, all the time they spend upside down is time where their effectiveness is limited because of what you did to them. That, to me, meets the definition of damage in BattleBots. It's only temporary, but it still meets that definition. I think that should be accounted for. And then the final thing I would do, which honestly just gets rid of an annoying conversation, is to score damage purely in terms of how much damage each robot has at the end of the fight. Don't worry about how it happened. That's a control and aggression thing. Get rid of this idea of it has to be intentional action. Just who is more or less damaged at the end, and apply points for that. So if you're Ray Billings and you've accidentally driven Tombstone into a wall and broken the bar, you shouldn't have done that. That's not necessarily points to the other person, but it's kind of points off of you. Almost like a deductive way of doing damage.
Yep.
And I think that is genuinely all you would need to give non-spinners a fairer footing in judges' decisions. And I am expecting comments. I'm expecting people to either love or hate everything I have just said. And I will fight to the... No, I won't, but I genuinely believe that they are all sensible suggestions. The inversion thing I know is a bit weird, but there is precedent for it.
Yeah, inversion kind of makes sense. Like you said, you are intentionally reducing the functionality of your opponent, and that is that damage? I don't know. It's the temporariness of it that kind of makes that interesting. But that also goes against what you said about like damage should be scored by how much damage is on your robot at the end of it. And if halfway through the fight you're upside down and then you flip yourself the right way up before the end, is there any damage? It's quantum damage points.
It should be a combination of those two factors.
Okay, brilliant.
I think there are very easy ways to implement that. Very easy ways to implement that. That isn't the, let's work out how much of a weight bonus we're going to give. That's assess the damage and then modify based on that one single thing. Or even better, don't have judging points at all, but that will never work for TV.
You need points. You need rules. You need defined things for these things.
You need points for commentators to talk about afterwards.
I think that's largely a reasonable set of suggestions, I think. I think there's the questions I have are implementation details, like how do you measure damage? Do you go through and say this, go video game style and say this robot has 60% of its shields gone or something like?
That's a problem they're already solving every fight when they make a damage judgment anyway.
Yeah.
That's not something that would necessarily need to change. I also want to clarify something quickly. I used Ray Billings and Tombstone as an example there purely because that's what happened in the rotator fight, and we spoke about it at some length. Just want to clear that up for anyone that doesn't have that context. That is not a personal attack on Ray. I'm smarter than that. Attack someone with a hammer bot because they're useless.
How do you deal with damage, like internal damage? Like, do the judges get to go and inspect the robot afterwards, or do you just take the word of the people building it? Do they have to be honest about how much damage was done internally? Like, how do you measure and define like electrical damage and all that kind of stuff? Like these are the kinds of questions I have. The minutiae of your plan here. Again,
that's an extension of the current system where damage is judged in terms of things that have affected your ability to function. So if a speed controller has blown and you've lost one side of drive, well, one side of drive isn't working. That's a reduction in effectiveness. Therefore, that is damage. Doesn't matter why it happened, doesn't matter if you smoked it yourself, doesn't matter if a saw or a crusher went straight through it. Something on your robot is not working, therefore that is damage. If your drive has clearly slowed partway through the fight, that is a form of damage.
So if you took damage that didn't affect the functionality of your robot, then that can be ignored?
Yeah, that's cosmetic damage as it is now. It is counted, but doesn't count for much, if anything. That's no different to the current system.
If you had like a redundant system with lots of receivers and then like two of them died and you still had one left, there's no damage there.
So this is the duck kind of thing, isn't it, really? Where, again, that's just good design. If it doesn't reduce your effectiveness, then, yeah, you wouldn't judge it. Same way we don't now. Whereas if it's something like the Yeti fight, I think it was, where Duck was clearly slowing down because of something, again, we don't have to worry about what, we don't have to worry about how it happened. We just look at that effect and go, damaged. Bosh.
Just damaged. Don't care how, don't care what it is, just like damaged. Just put labels on their thing. Just got like a big sticker, damaged.
The whole judge's scorecard is just the word damaged, ? And a tick box yes and a tick box no. Oh no, it's another draw. Everything comes down to aggression anyway.
Perfect.
Oh, and my final suggestion is to add a style criteria, obviously.
But that's so subjective, man.
My favourite thing about watching Bogglebots back is watching Bob struggle every time there's a judge's decision to not put style into the judging criteria.
Can you imagine winning a fight on style alone?
Yes, I can. I think it would be our only way.
Oh dear, how silly. Well, I think that I have the ultimate solution to all of these problems with judging.
What's that?
And that is to replace the human judges with machine learning models.
Perfect. Oh God, imagine using the last 2 or 3 seasons of BattleBots as training data for an AI system. Oh, the horror.
Dear. The horror. Well, unless you have anything else to talk about with robot stuff, I think we can move on to some talking about machine learning and artificial intelligence.
What a shocking surprise that is what you're moving on to. I could never have seen this coming.
Yeah.
If you're here for robots and robots alone, thank you for being here. We respect your choices. Feel free to leave. In like a non-aggressive way.
Here's the door.
No, not that at all. We're done talking about robots. We're going to talk about AI. If you enjoy that, then happy days.
So recently there has been a bit of a splash in the tech sphere, the tech blogosphere, about machine learning yet again. So I'm going to try and be really quick going through this. In the US, Apple have partnered with Goldman Sachs to release a credit card, the Apple Card or whatever, and whatever system they are using to... Right, so you have to like apply for the credit card, and then once, if you sort of get accepted to have the card, if they allow you to have it, then there's a credit limit. I'm not overly familiar with how credit cards work, so I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail.
And yet that's
there.
exactly what you've just described, just the basics of how you get a credit card.
Well, that's genuinely about as much as I know. I'm sort of vaguely aware that there's like limits on like spend. There's like is there like an absolute, like you can go at most this much into debt, but also on top of that, there's a certain amount of like throughput, or I don't know. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant.
You're asking someone who was scared to have a debit card because he didn't trust himself with it.
The point is that they have a system for deciding who is allowed to have the credit card, and once they're allowed to have it, how much money they can spend with it. And a few sort of well-known people in that sphere have made complaints or made the observation and then complained about the difference in the credit limit between them and their wives. And what it would appear to be is that there's, this one, I can't remember any of their names, which is terrible, but like there's a dude, and he shares all of his like finance stuff with his wife. So they have joint financing, they do all their tax returns together for whatever that's worth. And they have basically the same credit score. The guy's wife's score is actually better than his. And yet, I feel really bad just doing this without any names. It's terrible. Anyway, dude's wife has a significantly lower credit limit from the Apple Card than he does. And went through customer support for Apple and Goldman Sachs trying to figure out what's going on, why is that, and keep hitting walls of like, this is what the algorithm has decided. We don't know why it's decided this is for you to, but that's what it is, and we can't change it. Now, despite Apple constantly saying that going to the press doesn't help, making it big and public has solved the problem, as it always does with these things. Apple don't like bad press, so they sort of silently fix these things from time to time. And so I think the problems in these individual cases have sort of been solved with human intervention. But it would appear that it is hard for human intervention to happen in this system, and whatever algorithm, system, machine learning thing they're using to decide these things would appear to be sexist. That's the punchline here, and the complaints are sort of big enough and numerous enough that there has been like some formal investigation launched by some financial authority in the US into this to try and understand what's going on, because I think it is illegal to use someone's gender to decide credit limits.
So much to unpick in this. Don't know where to start. So this tweaks a couple of things for me. The key one of which is this idea that these systems are being implemented in ways that humans cannot override. That is a human decision. Someone has decided to not allow the people on the ground to question the all-knowing, all-powerful system. That is ridiculous, and I don't understand why they do that.
I have an explanation for that, but it's not a justification.
Sounds good to me. I wasn't expecting a justification. I think it's inherently unjust.
I think that the people implementing these systems, I think that they think that machines can't be biased, and therefore human intervention would only introduce bias. So that's why it's done that way.
And we'll explain all the ways in which that is wrong soon.
Yeah, so I think we should start with a quick sort of primer and try and get some groundwork laid down for what we're talking about here. So I want to quickly run over, for the purposes of this discussion, not sure if these are formal definitions that apply to the wider world or not. It's not really important. For the purposes of this discussion right now, we're going to define artificial intelligence, machine learning, and artificial general intelligence, which I think are the three things that people sort of talk about and conflate when discussing this kind of stuff. Does that seem fair?
Absolutely.
So, I'm going to start with artificial intelligence, which, for the purposes of this, I'm going to define as an artificial system that can make a decision. It doesn't need to have any capacity for learning or evolving on its own. None of that stuff. It's just, it can make a decision. And I would describe this as a pile of if statements. A good example of this that I'm going to try and use as an example, as a through-line example for all these things. One of the things I work on at work is a log analysis tool, and it can parse and interpret sort of arbitrary text files. So without telling it anything about the file, you point it at a file and it will go and identify where the timestamps are, where the request paths are, where the response codes are, and it will automatically, without human intervention, tokenize and interpret all the data in this text file. And it's pretty cool. This does not use machine learning. So this is in the broadest scope of artificial intelligence. It is making decisions about what this text file is and how to interpret it without human input. And it is all handcrafted by a handful of people. And if something goes wrong in this system, I can tell you exactly why. I could given a few hours, if you gave me an example of a file that it doesn't deal with correctly, I could point you to the exact area of code that's been written by a human that is causing it to go wrong. And then I, as a human, could fix that. I can then make the appropriate changes so that it can support that. So yeah, artificial intelligence, I think, is a very sort of broad definition, pile of if statements, nothing too fancy, just normal programming. Does that make sense?
So we're talking on the level of Chomp's automated hammer kind of stuff here.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's making a decision. It's got a bunch of inputs coming in and it's deciding, is this a thing that's close enough for me to hit, and then firing the hammer and stuff. It is artificial intelligence, but it's the boring kind. It's
the kind of artificial intelligence that when people hear the words artificial intelligence, they instantly dismiss as not being good enough. And I would have been the same on this until I attended an excellent debate on the matter. So yeah, I'm more than happy with that definition. Again, this is mostly just us making sure that we're discussing the same things in the same way, but that also seems like a good general definition.
So the next level up from that, a subset of this artificial intelligence is machine learning. And this is, I would describe, first of all, I do not have a degree in computer science. My degree is hardware and software engineering. I haven't done any formal education on machine learning, which I think you generally do in computer science degrees. and I don't use it at work. So like I don't really have much hands-on experience with this stuff, but I have a rough idea of how it works at a high level. So machine learning is a system that can figure out for itself how to do something. A common example of this kind of stuff is some kind of categorization system. So you have this system that has a way of evolving or changing itself in some way, or cloning itself in a new way or whatever like that, and you give it a bunch of annotated data, and this is data that you want it to be able to categorize in some way, and you give it both the thing that you want it to categorize and also the answer, and then you just feed it an insane amount of this data and give it some time, and it will think about it for a while, and it will come up with a system on its own of it will convert that into numbers, and then it will do a bunch of maths, and it will tweak the maths that it's doing until it gives answers that line up with the annotations that you gave it at the beginning. And that's the process called training. And then once you've trained this system, you can give it data that's not been annotated in any way, and it will do the same thing it's already done. And in general, it will correctly identify things for inputs it's never seen before. Some more advanced things can also learn after their initial training period. They can kind of like feed back into themselves and continue to develop. Some of them are closed things that are trained once and then never change again. But that's broadly what that is. I think an important distinction here with the like log parsing stuff is you could apply this to that same problem. You could give it a huge data set of log files that have been pre-annotated with where everything is, and say, well, this is from an Apache web server, this is from a W3C server, or what would that be, IIS. Anyway, this is from all these different things, and this is what all the tokens look like and where they are, and this bit here is a timestamp, and this bit here is the request path and stuff. And you could do that, and then it would figure it out, and it would be very good, I imagine. I think it would be a very effective way of solving this problem. But when something goes wrong, I wouldn't be able to tell you why. I'd be in the situation where it's like, well, the machine didn't understand that, and the only thing I can do to fix it is to retrain it with more data. I couldn't go in and do like a handcrafted fix, and I can't understand how it works. Like these systems are like not really knowable by humans. They're these black boxes that just have lots of maths going on inside them, and they spit out answers, and you can't explain why they work, how they work or anything like that. It's just they do work, and they work very well, and the only way to change them is to retrain them. I feel like that was less eloquent than my artificial intelligence one, but it'll do. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So machine learning is what, if you ever hear people talking about artificial intelligence, I think machine learning, as I've just defined it, is generally speaking what people are talking about.
Yeah, this is kind of the current state of AI, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is your YouTube algorithms and all of that.
Yeah, so anything that Google talk about with like their artificial intelligence and stuff, or photo recognition, or algorithms for recommendations, all kinds of stuff. This is all machine learning stuff, and it is that kind of thing.
And then we get into the sci-fi, don't have to worry about in our lifetime kind of stuff after that.
Yeah, so the next level up from this is artificial general intelligence, and the only reason I wanted to talk about this is to just like draw the distinction between artificial intelligence and this, because I've obviously given a very broad definition of artificial intelligence that's quite dumb, but when people hear the phrase artificial intelligence, I think what they often think is this other level, which is artificial general intelligence. And I think this is really hard to sort of fully define what it is. But basically, if you have an artificial system that is indistinguishable from a conscious entity, a conscious being, then you've got artificial general intelligence, in that something you can converse with, and it has it would appear to have its own thoughts and wants and desires and all that. Well, maybe not even that. I don't know. Like, this is really hard. It's really nebulous, really hard to define, but it's just this sort of thing that would be indistinguishable from a living conscious entity.
That matches up with the way I've had it explained to me before, in terms of a machine that operates in a way that would be recognisable to a human, that sort of matches up with our idea of how we work. Because everything you've spoken about in terms of machine learning as I understand it, and forgive me if this is a gross oversimplification, is basically a big set of calculations. Although I suppose that's technically what any... This is dangerous territory for me.
It all boils down to maths in the end.
Yeah, with sort of neural networks, you can literally boil it down to a set of calculations that have just been narrowed down as the set that get you from A to B in the way you expect. That's probably made things worse rather than better. Forget I spoke. I hear one expert talk, and I think I'm an expert too, and it just doesn't work.
AGI is really hard to define. And it's also proper like sci-fi. It is interesting to think about like what would happen if we did it. Like if you had artificial general intelligence, would it try and kill us? Or would it try and kill us? Would it successfully kill us? Would it kill us without meaning to? All interesting questions. Questions around how you contain it. You know, if you haven't, like, you know, how do you make it safe? How do you develop this and not have it do, I don't know, something horrific and stuff? So those are sort of like interesting things to think about, but they're not going to be the focus of today's discussion. It's something that's miles off. It's incredibly complicated. We're nowhere near making it. It's the realm of science fiction, and my personal view is that we shouldn't even try and make it because it will kill us all.
We'll save all of this for our live commentary track of iRobot that we're going to do for episode 100.
Are we committed to that now? Is that what's just happened?
I mean, I'm sure as hell not committed to that. It was when I was 16, I thought that was the greatest film that would ever be made because it had Will Smith and robots.
Yeah, I think it's all right. Like, it's not a brilliant film, but like it's all right. I've
sidetracked us. Continue.
What I find funny about that, so that I won't go into it. I've forgotten too much about the books, but like the books are really funny because they're not finding like a flaw in the 3 laws of robotics. It's kind of like people think that they don't need one of the laws and they sort of like ignore or modify it, and then terrible things happen. It's sort of like the film is so different from the books. Anyway,
I should read it. Carry on.
It is vaguely interesting. So yeah, that's all 3 things. Does that all make sense?
Mm-hmm. And now we're going to focus on just one of them.
I'm just going to elaborate quickly on why I think that AGI would kill us, by the way.
Do it.
So I think that if you have an artificial general intelligence that is significantly more intelligent than humans and like can think a lot faster, I think that you can't contain it. And I think regardless of, unless you happen to come up with one that likes humans for some reason, I think it's just going to try really hard. Right, so you can't say that an AGI has a consciousness or morality in any way. It has its own wants and desires, but has no sort of like human level sort of consciousness, really, necessarily. It might do, it might not. I don't know how consciousness arises. And I don't think you can contain one. If you have an AI in a box and it's got any way of communicating with the outside world, if it's sufficiently intelligent, given enough time, it can always convince the people responsible for it through some kind of just genuinely just argue them into acting against their best interests, or it can trick them into doing something, or it could find some way of like waggling this wire which happens to cause some kind of inductance in something nearby, and then that's how it gets out of its box slowly over time, or all these things, and you know, anything where you have it communicating with the outside world through that interaction. I think that a sufficiently intelligent thing can get itself out given time, and then once it's out, it's got its own wants and desires, and if it doesn't care about humans, which is quite likely, it will just kind of do them because it doesn't necessarily have any regard for human life, and so it'd be like, oh, I'm just gonna, I don't know, like I just think that it will just kind of inadvertently just kind of end us in some way, not necessarily through kind of like war, but like I just think it would just sort of, if we put this kind of stuff in charge of like our financial stuff, which it largely is already, it could just end humanity by just changing that. Like I think it could just inadvertently do something that just ends humanity as we know it. So yeah, AGI I think is a dumb idea. I might cut that whole thing. That was a bit of a ramble.
You just accidentally hit on a major plot point from Rick and Morty.
Excellent. We should stop me from rambling about AGI because it's just these are unformed thoughts. I think we should step away from. So let's pull it back to machine learning, and I think we can start with the relatively benign uses of machine learning that are good and useful, and then we can talk about the way that machine learning is used and is biased and terrible, and we shouldn't use it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a bunch of relatively benign things that it's used for, which is genuinely good. Like it's used a lot for categorization of stuff. So if you use any kind of modern photo management thing, like Apple's iCloud photo library thing, or Google has Google Photos, all the photos on Facebook have stuff done to them as well. And they use these machine learning systems to improve the compression of them, so they use less space. But they also use machine learning and computer vision to categorize and sort of decide what's in the pictures. So Google's Google Photos is very impressive in that you can search. You've just got a search box at the top of your Google Photos thing, and you can search for specific people by name. You can search for locations. You can search for pictures in France with the Eiffel Tower, and it will find the pictures that actually contain the Eiffel Tower in it. You can do all kinds of crazy searches because it can look at the picture, not quite like a human, but it can analyze the picture and use computer vision and decide what's in there, which is super cool. Have you ever used it? And like Facebook obviously use it for their facial recognition stuff, like they will like recommend tags for people and stuff like that. Have you ever sort of used any of this stuff, like the Google Photos thing?
I don't know what it is. The only thing I can think of that seems similar is reverse image searching. I don't know if that's related.
Yeah, so Google will have as they're indexing pictures, they will do computer vision on them and sort of tag the image with everything that's in it. And then when you do a reverse image search, it can find stuff that's visually similar, but it will also sort of look at the picture you've uploaded and go, well, this contains a dog. And it might also find other pictures of dogs as a result.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing I'm used to. And I suppose as we go through these, I've got three vague categories of machine learning in mind that have this kind of hierarchy of acceptability to me. And this all comes from, at my summer work, we hosted a debate on AI, which was about whether it was a threat or a service to humanity. And we did a lot of work as part of that around the current uses and the proposed uses and their impacts. And this is the kind of thing that seems like it's only beneficial. So this isn't something where we previously did it with humans and they've all lost their jobs because the machine is doing it better than them. This is a thing that we couldn't do, and we've developed a way to do it, and we now have a tool that we didn't previously have. And it's really hard to see any downside to this kind of stuff.
In terms of the technical implementation, I agree that like hand crafting stuff that can do this kind of computer vision would be insane. I think there are sort of implications that are sort of separate from the technology itself. The main, like, I don't use Google Photos, despite how cool it is, because it's all done on a computer and a server that I don't own and control. And I think the way that a lot of these things work is that under conditions where the machine learning hasn't worked properly, there might be some kind of human intervention from like a Google employee who will look at the picture themselves and stuff. So for me, there's a privacy concern that I have in that this is not machine learning that's done on my device. I think that's not true for Apple Photos. I don't use that either because I don't have enough Apple devices to care about it. But like for Google, at least, all the processing is done on their servers, which means it can be very powerful and fast. But it also means that all my pictures are on someone else's server, unencrypted, and there are conditions under which people can see that picture. This is also true for those like voice assistant things. If you have like an Amazon Echo with Alexa, or if you have a HomePod with Siri, or what is it, Google Home with Hey Google. I'm just trying to trigger as many as I can. This is a similar kind of thing where speech to text is hard to do without some kind of machine learning. And again, people employed by those companies can listen to the recordings, and that is so there's that privacy concern, which is separate to, but I think related to the technology because it's all server-side processing. But yeah, in terms of just the technology itself, then yeah, these are all benign and useful things and a good application for machine learning, I think.
I think it's very important that we put that kind of privacy stuff aside when having this conversation. Not because it's not valid or even in a way not relevant, but because it's not inherent to the technology. It is, again, a set of human decisions that have been made by the people implementing it.
Yeah, it is definitely possible to do a lot of this stuff locally. There are technical reasons to do it on a server and have it all done like, because then you can learn, because Google Photos can learn from other people's photos to make the recognition of my stuff better. Whereas if it was just a local system that only operated on my photos, it might have problems with things that I've never photographed before. So there is, and again, for these kinds of like general purpose recognition stuff, you need massive data sets, and the way to get those data sets is to just harvest as much data as possible, and that's what Google is really good at, which is why their machine learning is generally industry leading. So there are technical things that lead to implementations that should trigger people's sort of like privacy alarms in these ways, but yeah, like it's not the core of this discussion. Although I will say, please don't buy those voice assistant things, because they are just like, why would you have a microphone in your house? It's just mad. That's always listening and sending stuff to someone else. It's just mad. Just don't do it. Don't buy them. Anyway.
I'm glad you added that second part while talking into a microphone.
Yeah, obviously I have a microphone, but like I turn it off after we're done recording, and it's not just sending my voice to Amazon constantly.
So yeah, I know how hard it's going to be for you to not talk about privacy, but I'm proud of you for trying.
I'll do my best.
So that is the really benign stuff. The other thing that comes to mind for me is stuff like, and this is separate to talk of social media that I know you're going to enjoy later, is things like the Netflix algorithm, which you're going to argue this is evil anyway, but I maintain that if you're on Netflix looking for things, you want Netflix to be good at recommending you things. And not only does Netflix do the usual thing of deciding what sort of things it thinks you want to watch and recommending them, it also makes a set of decisions about how to recommend them in terms of what thumbnail is most likely to appeal to you, what blurb is most likely to appeal to you. And that, I think, is just really cool.
For most of my kind of like content watching stuff, like I don't like these kind of like algorithms for recommending stuff to me. Like I know what I want to watch, and I discover new content through other people talking to me about it. And so Netflix has a lot of this sort of like algorithmic recommendation stuff, which I can generally ignore, because it also has in the top left whatever I was last watching, and that's the thing that I want. I just want to have a button that goes just continue that series where I left off, and I don't think it needs machine learning for that. And all the other recommendations are interesting, but like, I mean, sometimes I guess I do discover a new thing via their recommendation algorithms and stuff, but like, I don't know. I have the problem I have with them, and like the custom thumbnails and all that kind of stuff is that it's a less egregious form, I think, of what happens on YouTube, where it really depends on what they're optimizing for here, and so. The thing is, any of these things that's optimizing for engagement will often end up recommending stuff that is engaging and causes me to like watch it, but not necessarily stuff that I enjoy. And that's a distinction that I think is worth bearing in mind with these kind of like recommendation algorithms. But yeah, like the Netflix one is like the least egregious one that I can sort of think of. But like, yeah, it's still pretty close to the crazy stuff that YouTube does, in my view.
I don't know why I view them so differently, because they are trying to achieve the same thing of keeping you on platform. But I feel like with Netflix, what you don't have is a group of people making content trying to exploit that same algorithm.
Yeah, I think the distinction is that the stuff on Netflix is slightly more curated, so you don't get quite as much kind of like extremist stuff on there, or you don't get things that are, like you said, trying to exploit this system for some reason, for some unsavory gain and stuff. So it's the same technology, but I think the context of where it's being deployed makes it less egregious to me on Netflix than on YouTube.
Maybe it's just like a weird Stockholm syndrome I've got with Netflix. Where are we going next with this? You choose. Choose your own adventure.
I think we should carry on and look at how YouTube and social media in general deploys this kind of stuff, because this for me is where I really draw the line, where I think it's gone too far and is an issue that needs to be addressed by society. So most social networks and things like and sort of these like online content aggregators and stuff have the algorithm. You know, if you've been on YouTube, you will have heard people talking about the algorithm. Like, it's such an important part of making content for YouTube and has such dramatic impact on that. But it's also present on all other kinds of social media. If you've got a social network that has some kind of feed or timeline, can pretty much guarantee that timeline is not in reverse chronological order. It will be in some order that some machine learning thing has decided is most likely to keep you on the platform.
The time has been taken out of the timeline.
Yeah, it's just a huge mess of stuff. And I've noticed, by the way, that Reddit has become worse about this than it used to be. So there's this is a complete sidetrack, but it bothers me. So there's, like Reddit has the stuff that you're subscribed to, and it will order that however it wants, and that's fine. And then it has like the all and popular sort of like aggregate kind of things that are just stuff from all over the website. I can't speak for all. I haven't been on there in a while, but the popular one is not as pure as I thought it was in terms of this is stuff that's popular across all of the website. And I'm going to give you two reasons why I think that this is. I'm sure Reddit have announced some algorithm that they've done for doing this, but like, anecdotally, the two things that I've noticed that really make me go, this is an algorithm that is doing stupid things, is one, I get an enormous number of posts from Am I the Arsehole, which is just obviously, makes people angry. So I think that's why that's there a lot. And the other one is that I recently subscribed to a programming subreddit, and all of a sudden, like subreddits like Python and Learn Programming and Programmer Humor, they're suddenly much more popular in the UK than they used to be. Like, it's almost as if me subscribing to this one programming thing has suddenly made programming across the entire UK so much more popular. I'm like, no, this is not the point of the popular thing. I don't want to see the things that I'm subscribed to. I want to see the other things that the rest of the world cares about at the moment. And it bothers me that this is like, it's got this bubble thing going on, and it's got the shock factor of the slightly sort of shocking subreddits, but not the really extreme ones that are bad for advertising. It's just like, so that's all algorithmic and annoying and icky now as well.
Is nowhere sacred.
Nowhere is sacred. But yeah, like Twitter is algorithmic. Facebook is definitely algorithmic. They all are. Instagram does it as well. And so these are robots. These are machines. These are algorithms that are optimized, or they're tasked with keeping you on that platform. They're tasked with keeping you there for as long as possible so that you see as much advertising as possible. And that leads them to make interesting decisions about what to recommend you. And one of the things that I think generally keeps people around or makes people sort of like engage by the way they measure it is shock stuff, is the sort of the shock factor, and having these. The algorithms often seem to end up playing on quite negative emotions to keep you around. And I think that this, because all the social media stuff does it, and because all this social media has such deep penetration into society today, I think that this has an enormous impact on society. I can tell you that I have a much more negative view of the state of the world than I think is fair. Like, I think when I separate myself from the computers and sort of like think about how my life actually is in terms of the stuff that directly affects me, the world seems pretty good, actually. Like, there are nice people all over the place and things are going reasonably well. There are definitely problems in the wider world, like the political climate is horrific, but like, I think that social media has a lot to answer for with regards to things like the current political climate, because I think that these are tools that are used by people for nefarious means to try and change political direction. And I think they also, even if they're not being exploited by people, I think that they just do, because they are trying to keep people engaged. And a good way to keep people engaged is to keep them sort of shocked and angry. I think you end up with a bunch of people that think the world is terrible. And I think that has a large impact on society. And the companies that deploy these things are not taking responsibility for it. Like, you can see Facebook is constantly trying to deflect responsibility for a lot of these, spreading of misinformation, all that kind of stuff. And this is where, like I said, I think machine learning has a lot to answer for and isn't being at the moment. And you need to sort of think carefully when deploying this kind of stuff, because the decisions these machines make have a shockingly large impact on society as a whole. I'm going to go and ramble in circles, so I'm going to stop there.
This falls into kind of my second category of machine learning having an impact on people, bad or good. That sentence didn't get away from me at all. Which is AI acting as a technology which has allowed arseholes to be arseholes more efficiently. So I personally believe that social media would always have gone in this direction. The aim would always have been to get more people reacting to more stuff and staying on their platform. And odds are this would have always been the way, this idea of throw controversy at people because people react to it most, make them feel either way kind of thinking, which has been a part of marketing for decades and a part of the media for decades. And what machine learning has done is given companies a far more efficient way of making that happen. So you could envisage a version of YouTube, in fact, some people believe this is genuinely the case anyway, where that big recommended thing that I never look at is completely curated by humans. That is a thing that would be feasible, but they don't have to do it that way. They can do it on a much bigger scale and much more efficiently without using people and using the machines instead. And I'm always very careful to not hold it against the machines, because there are probably ways. This all comes down to the measure of success that you give the machine. These are machine learning systems that are sort of on a constant feedback loop. Is that right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, these are the kinds of things that will learn from the internet, which is often a bad idea as well. But yeah, they're not as far as I'm aware, they're not a fixed unit. They're like they do develop on their own as well.
My understanding is that they are given a goal of, for example, I know this isn't the current one, or this isn't supposed to be, but YouTube and increase watch time. So it tries different ways of doing things and measures the effect that has on watch time. If it increases it, it does that more. That's the sort of vague idea. So if YouTube wanted to, and I'm picking on them because it's the one I understand most, if they went, well, you know what, we don't like the societal impact that our algorithm is currently having, whilst they can't dig down into it and find out why it's making the decisions it is, they could, in principle, change the goal. And there are, presumably, goals that lead to better outcomes for people that probably aren't just as profitable. And it is that set of human decisions that bothers me.
Mm.
This is a dumb machine being asked to do things that aren't good for us. A very clever dumb machine, but a dumb machine nonetheless. And there's a really important distinction here between this and what you were talking about in the case of Apple and the credit cards. Because the system with the credit cards is basically being trained to do what a human would have done. They've given it a load of data of, okay, here are people who applied in the past, here are the decisions we made, we want you to make those same decisions. We want you to agree with us in the past. And that's a very different thing. That's where we get all of these biases coming in that I'm sure you're itching to talk about, and all the problems that are inherent with them. This feels salvageable. The social media situation feels salvageable, and they're just choosing not to.
Yeah, I think that probably fundamentally the thing that salvages it is the thing that makes it less profitable. And in this part of the world, at least, profit is a very important thing. So I don't have a lot of hope for that changing without some kind of like pretty extreme external force from governments. But yeah, it's a societal. Where am I going with this? I think I largely agree with things you've said. Like, it's not that these things are intentionally designed to do something horrific. It's just like they're giving a goal, and the logical consequence of that goal is a negative for society that these companies are not taking responsibility for or doing measures to address. But then that's really hard as well, because then you end up with like these companies are at the end of the day, it comes down to a handful of very powerful people at the top. And should they really be the people deciding what is good for society and stuff? Like, should they be deciding we're going to suppress political views from a particular party? Like, I don't think that's a reasonable thing to ask a company to do. Like, I don't think that these big, huge conglomerates should be controlling the direction of society, which they largely are these days, and that's quite upsetting to me.
So, having alluded to it, do you want to talk about this sort of... I suppose I was talking about it as a general model, really, but specifically the stuff with the sort of finance side of things.
Yeah, so this is an area where I see a lot of things that frustrate me when people talk about machine learning, in that the people developing and deploying this often seem to believe that the system they've developed and are deploying is not biased because it's a computer. It can't have human bias because it doesn't think like us. And I'm not saying that everyone who develops this stuff thinks that or anything like that. I'm just saying that in general, the impression I get is that for the most part, people don't seem to think that it can be biased, or don't realise that it's biased. That's the other big one, is they don't realise that the system they've developed is biased. And so the areas that you see this are, a big one that has been in the news recently is obviously the financial stuff, but it's used in other areas of society as well. And so yeah, we can talk about that a little bit. And so you said before that, like, these systems that are designed to replace humans are trained on historical data, and the measure of success for that training is how closely it agrees with the historical data. And when you phrase it like that, it becomes painfully obvious why these things are biased, because they will learn the bias from the data set that you give it. I would say that machine learning exposes and amplifies the biases of the people that made it without fail. It will always do that. And because it's based entirely on whatever you feed it. So if you've got lots of historical financial data that you want to sort of like decide credit limits based on that, and it's making a decision based on, this is the information that I had, and then this is the credit limit that the human gave to the person, it will take all of that things. Now, humans are biased. There is this long-standing and, I would argue, inaccurate stereotype that women can't be trusted with money, and I think that's a load of rubbish. It's bogus, but it's a stereotype that exists and is codified in the historical data for credit limits. And so if you train your system on that, it has no other choice but to pick up that bias. And so the machine learning model will also be sexist because the people that came before it were. And if the data you're training on was perfect, it would be a lot better. But because it's based on this imperfect system that came before it, where, like, well, you've got two people that are like come in separately, and like on the one day you sort of like that have got the same credit score, and the one day you give the man this, and then without really thinking about it, the human just kind of gives the woman the lower one because of some internalized bias that they're not necessarily aware of. And then you've got that in the world now, and then the machine is going to copy that. Even if it doesn't necessarily know the gender of the person applying, the data will kind of reveal and codify that in other ways, and the machine will just pick up on it because it has to, because that's all it's got to learn from. And then it will propagate these biases forwards as well. And people seem to forget that and not realise that that's how this works. And then they go, oh, well, it's the machine, it can't be biased, so like it must be something else that's causing it to give you a lower credit limit. And it's like, no, it's because you've trained it on bad data.
It's pure pattern recognition and pattern replication, which in so many ways just makes it a mirror of anything good or bad. And you sort of said earlier about the people doing this seem to think it can't be biased. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think there's a more nuanced version of that, which is that they're aware that it can be biased, but because it has their bias, they don't notice it. I think we only notice biases that we don't agree with. So the fact it's picking up their version of reality is a big win to them. And the really upsetting thing is that without a feedback loop in place, it completely precludes any possibility of progress. If you keep humans doing this, the sort of positive but painfully slow societal changes that we're seeing will eventually filter through into people making decisions that aren't sort of biased in this way. And if people keep doing that, people keep getting better, or potentially getting worse, but hopefully getting better, and things improve. Whereas what we've got here is a system that just takes a snapshot of now and keeps doing it unless someone makes it change.
You have a really interesting compounding problem here, actually, because like you said, like you only notice bias if it's bias that you either don't agree with or if it's bias that's against you. So what's interesting is that a lot of these, you know, the bias here is sexism. And if you think about the state of the industry that's developing these systems, it's predominantly men. And so the decisions made by the humans before didn't negatively affect men. And so the systems that the decisions that the machines are making are also not negatively affecting men. And because it's primarily men developing and testing the system initially, they don't notice the problem. And so if you had a more diverse group of people developing this system, I think that they would notice the problem sooner, and you'd notice it before it got into production. So there's like a compounding problem there, where like, not only is the historical data bias, but the people developing it don't realise it's biased because then they themselves aren't very diverse and sort of represent the same biases in there. Which is why I would sort of say, you know, these systems, they will always expose the biases of the people developing it. So if you have a very sort of like undiverse group of people, then you're going to get a lot of bias out of that.
And I'm struggling to tell if what you're saying there is, well, it might not be trying to imply anything, but is that a positive view of the future? Is that a pessimistic view of the future? I can't even really tell. Because part of it says that if we can increase diversity in these areas, maybe we've got a better chance of positive outcomes. If we can educate the people who are doing it differently, maybe we're going to get better outcomes. But then the pessimist/realist in me says, that just won't happen.
I think the problem won't solve itself at the moment because you've got this sort of multi-layered thing where systems are being produced that are biased, and they're being produced by people that almost can't realise that they're biased because they don't experience the other side of that. So I think the point I'm trying to make is if the state of the technology industry remains the same, it's a predominantly male-dominated field and predominantly white male, frankly, like there's a proper monoculture in technology, and if that remains true forever, then the systems that industry produce will, again, not intentionally, but will often just have biases that don't affect that group of people. Because the group of people developing it don't necessarily realise that what they've produced is sexist or racist or any other form of ist. And so I think, you know, if you had if the industry that's producing this stuff was more diverse, I think the output would be better because it would just naturally have a more complete picture of the data coming into it to train it.
I mostly agree with all of that. But the issue I still have, and this I suppose has fed through to some of the language that I've used terms like sort of evil, which are really sort of hyperbolic and unnecessary, because I think most of the flaws we see, certainly in that area, they're not intentional things. But I do think there is a level of intent at the highest levels with this kind of thing, especially when we talk about social media. Maybe less so with this particular example, but I think the social media, for example, is mostly predicated on greed. It is, what is the most profitable use of this? And I'm not sure if that's something that you educate and diversify away from.
No, I think it's, you know, there's lots of things there.
Basically, I worry that it sounds like we're kind of blaming a large group of people. Not even blaming is a very strong word there. Sort of implicating, is that right?
What I'm not blaming people for this, because this is one of those things I think is kind of like inherent to, how do I phrase this? If you've got a system that doesn't negatively affect you, you're just much less likely to find problems with it. And this is true of all kinds of programming, by the way. Like when I write software, I am rubbish at finding bugs in the code that I've written. But I can give it to someone who's never looked at the code, and I promise you that someone who's never seen it will find a bug within within minutes or sometimes of seeing it. Like I'll be working on a bit of code for ages, like a week into this thing, testing it in all the ways that I can think to test it, and I do all this kind of stuff. I think, yeah, this is perfect. And then someone else immediately just goes, what if you do this? And I go, oh, I never thought of that. And you do it, and then the whole thing crashes. He's like, oh, well, that's a pretty obvious and stupid bug to have in there. And that happens all the time. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at with like the wider level of things, where if you've got a large group of people that all have a similar life experience and have similar ways of thinking and approaching a problem, then and if that large group of people is not representative of the target market for a thing, like if you think about the target market for these financial systems, it is an entire population of a country, for example. And so if the people developing it are not representative of that, then you're going to have the same thing that I've just described with my code that's immediately broken by the person who thinks slightly differently to me, but on a larger scale, where the code or the machine or the system that's developed by the large group of people with a monoculture is going to be immediately broken or revealed to be broken by the wider culture. So I think that's the point I'm trying to make. And then with the sort of like greed stuff at the higher level, I think, again, if the higher level is part of that same monoculture, I think that it's not like there's malice or intent to make it bad at that level. It's just like, well, the cost of fixing it is high. And so like I think that the greed at the high level, I think, slows down the progress. But like if the entire society rejects the thing and goes, this is rubbish, and nobody likes it, then, you'd hope that the pressure of society would be enough to sort of motivate even the greedy people at the very top of the pyramid from maybe convince them to do something about it, to reduce the bad press, if nothing else.
I guess what I was doing there, and I hope it was unnecessary to begin with, really, is I just wanted to make absolutely clear that we're not going, these are crappy people. And I guess I was worried that there's a very particular way of hearing it where it sounded that way. And I was trying to insulate against that, which was probably unnecessary.
Yeah, again, I don't think the people developing it are intentionally making biased systems. I think generally speaking, it's just they just don't know. There's that, what is that phrase? Like, don't attribute to malice what you can attribute to stupidity or something, or ignorance. And I think it's just that the people developing it are ignorant of the problems that are coming out of it. And more than anything, like I don't think that the people developing it necessarily are malicious in their intents, although I'm sure there are some people doing it. In general, people try to do the right thing, but are just, no one has full knowledge of everyone's experience of the world. So, you're never going to have this is why you need to approach it with, a diverse set of people will produce a more well-rounded solution to the problem because there's just more inputs to it.
Yeah, I feel like at this point I've kind of caused you to almost over-clarify on this point, and I apologise for that.
Okay. We can move on then. So the financial stuff is interesting in that this is where the bias stuff comes from, and this is where this starts really having an impact on people's day-to-day lives, because this is used for deciding credit limits, but it's also used in deciding who is eligible for loans. It's used for all kinds mortgages and all that kind of stuff. Like, if you want to buy a house and the algorithm decides that it doesn't think you're likely to pay that mortgage back, then it goes, well, no, you're not. We're not going to give that to you. And I think that's rubbish, especially if there's no way of overriding it by a human and stuff like that. So I think this is one of those things where this is a system that is unknowable, undebuggable by humans, and by policy not overridable by humans. That's not a technical constraint. It's just people choose not to override it because they think it's perfect. And I think it results in meaningful negative impacts on people's lives. And I think that is a shame. So there's other areas. I think the next one maybe is, do you want to talk briefly about healthcare? This is something where I think we disagree slightly on the impact of machine learning in this area.
Yeah, for me this is a bit of a loop back, but I think for you it belongs at this point in the conversation, doesn't it? In this sort of ascending scale of harm.
Yeah, so this is I think that machine learning in healthcare definitely has the potential to be more harmful than in finance. But yeah, we'll see. What do you make of machine learning in healthcare then?
So the stuff that I find most intriguing about the current state of AI and machine learning is the applications in things like healthcare. Because healthcare is obviously one of the areas where we are most aware of the potential harm that something can do. and it's where the most safeguards seem to be put in place. So the work that has been done with machine learning in healthcare has been done very, very carefully, and has been done in ways that I, in their current form, can only see the benefit of. So something that was spoken about at great length by the expert that came in to talk about this at my work, he was from the, what's it called? The Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. They basically look at things that they think might end humanity. And AI is one of the things on their list. And he spoke at some length about the work being done in cancer diagnosis, where one of the things that humans currently do as part of that process is they take samples from biopsies, look at them to work out if they are benign or malignant, and that obviously has a huge impact on the diagnosis and the future treatment. And people have developed some very robust image recognition systems that are significantly better at correctly identifying whether something is benign or malignant than the equivalent human, or than a human in general. So not only are they more accurate, so fewer false positives and fewer false negatives, they're also cheaper and faster. Now, with the obvious exception of that potentially putting a few people out of a job, that seems like an absolute win-win-win-win-win. I can see no downsides of something like that. We're doing a thing that positively affects people's lives, and we're doing it better.
Yeah, this is really interesting because there's like arguments of individual cases where the machine gets it wrong, but the doctor has where the machine and the doctor both look at the same image, and the machine goes, "There's no cancer," and the doctor goes, "I think there's cancer there," but the machine says no, so I'm going to say there's no, and then it gets all the other way around, where the machine says, I was saying the other way around. I've forgotten the first way around. Anyway, the machine and the human disagree, and then the human goes, "Well, I'm going to trust the machine over my own gut." And then that has a negative impact on and the machine is wrong, and that has a negative impact on the individual's life. I think that's a hard thing to reconcile because there's the same argument or similar argument with like self-driving cars and stuff. But then what you're saying
do not
is that,
trolley problem me right now. That is a argument.
But what you're saying is that these things are on average more accurate. So like even though there will be individual cases where the machine gets it wrong and the human got it right, but the human defers to the machine, then but on the whole, more people get accurate diagnoses. So it's a really tricky thing, I think, to reconcile when it comes to people's health and that kind of stuff. Where like, how do you deal with the inevitable situation where these two entities disagree, and what do you do? Like, do you always say that the human should go with what they think and just use the machine as a guideline? How do you correctly train for that? How do you measure that that's what they're doing? Like, how do you stop people from just deferring to the machine blindly? And it's like, and how do you deal with errors in the machine, or I don't know, stuff like that? It's just sort of really interesting, and the difference between the effect on individuals versus the effect on the sort of population as a whole. Where on the whole, this system is maybe more accurate, but for individual cases where, you know, I can imagine those individual cases where the human knows the right answer, the machine says the wrong answer, and they trust the machine over the human, and then the person is harmed, and that is a difficult thing to reconcile.
I blame the news and social media algorithms for this being a problem. Because the shocking headline of "machine kills human" in very rare case and very specific failing that could have been solved by a wider system is a far more appealing headline than "machines lead to better outcomes for pretty much everybody." We will always fixate on the mistake over the many, many mistakes that have been saved. No one gets angry at a human getting it wrong. People don't get as angry at a human missing a thing because it's a human making a mistake. And people want machines to be perfect or bust. And that is a problem with people, not the machines. And I completely agree that there are some societal barriers to all of this being implemented. And I suppose my viewpoint is predicated on the idea that those barriers are stupid. I see it as a win-win-win, but I also know that other people won't see it that way. So again, this isn't an issue with the technology, this is an issue with the people around it.
So I think with like very kind of specific deployments of this kind of stuff, I think it's because this is this is image recognition again. Like what you're describing is essentially image recognition. And I think that's a reasonably sort of safe application of this kind of technology. But I can imagine machine learning sort of being more widely deployed of as like a almost like a pre-filter or some way of getting like basic health advice. And like machines are not necessarily empathetic and stuff like that. I don't know. Like I just sort of think that a wider deployment of machine learning that's not really carefully thought out makes healthcare worse. I don't know. I think that human interaction is a really important part of healthcare, and I think that like trying to do it, I think there's a real danger that machine learning stuff and computing will get into healthcare in a way that's not to make it more accurate, but more to try and be as good as humans, but are significantly cheaper. And I think that makes it worse, because even if it's got the same level of accuracy, by removing human empathy, I think you make the whole experience worse and much more frustrating.
I completely agree with that, but I think you're at risk, at least, of drifting into the sci-fi stuff here of, oh no, what if there's a future where all the doctors are replaced by robots with smiley faces? Which is so far away from what we're talking about. Right now, we're talking about these systems being used in the labs, essentially.
But I can absolutely envision an app. Someone releases an app for your phone and you take a picture of a thing and then it will try and diagnose it, and it uses machine learning. And the machine says, oh, this is fine. And then it turns out not to be fine and stuff. Like, I just think this is one of those things where, considering healthcare outside of hospitals and like doctors' offices and stuff, where it's sort of being used by an expert in a careful way, that sort of seems reasonable. But when you sort of like put this kind of, here's an algorithm that will try and make decisions about your health, but without oversight from a medical professional, that sort of starts becoming a bit more dangerous, of people either becoming, I think this is already somewhat true, I think people are way too, I'm going to sound like an old man complaining about society, and I feel terrible about it already. I worry that people get worked up about things that they shouldn't be worked up about, because they like have a cough for a few weeks and then they look it up online and then they immediately think they have cancer. This is something that I'm guilty of. I think that this is something that will only be made worse if you start sort of having these virtual doctors on phones and stuff, which I think is a technology that might already exist. I'm not sure. I know that IBM have been investigating something about that with some of their machines, but yeah, I don't know. I just think it's, right now, I don't think it's a huge deal as long as it's used by experts, but it's one of those things I can really just see becoming a big kind of problem in society's health.
Again, this is drifting into the territory where I'm going to become a bit of a broken record and say that I'm not willing, I suppose is the best way to put this, I'm not willing to discount this stuff just because there are potential bad implementations. Implementation is a human problem.
I'm not trying to say that we should never do this because it's got the potential to be bad. I think that my agenda with this whole discussion is to try and encourage the people that are listening who may possibly be deploying this stuff, is to think really carefully about it. Like, this is like, I think that there is a lot of danger with the deployment of machine learning in healthcare that needs to be considered seriously before you do it. So yeah, I'm not saying that we can never use machine learning in healthcare. I'm just saying it needs to be carefully considered. And I think that it wasn't carefully considered with social media, and that's had fallout for society. So it's sort of like, that's my whole agenda here, is think carefully. This is a powerful tool and it needs to be used with great care and attention.
Yeah, and one of the things that makes me so optimistic about its use in healthcare is the fact there are far more checks and balances. I don't think anyone realised how harmful social media could potentially be until it already was. Whereas when it comes to healthcare, we already know that we're playing with people's lives. And to go down your route for a minute, I can think of some really dystopian futures where this kind of thing is being used. You know, I can imagine there being situations where you've got a drug shortage and a quite sort of wide-ranging, I suppose, machine learning setup is being used to prioritise who gets it and who has to go without. Which, even that, to be honest, you can kind of say, well, that's better than not deciding at all. I don't know if I want to be on record saying that, but you know what I mean. There are always going to be viewpoints where it's sort of the needs of the many and that sort of thing. I don't like where I'm going with this. This is evil Ryan now.
What you're describing is a really, really hard problem, and I don't know the solution, and people might go, "Oh, we're going to use machine learning," but then it's like I said, it becomes a question of what the biases and the priorities of the people that developed it are and stuff. So it's sort of
That's interesting, actually, because I could see them going with something like that, so they're seen to take a human out of the loop, but you're not really taking the humans out of the loop.
no. This is the thing where I think machine learning often just kind of hides the human bias, or like doesn't hide it, sort of obfuscates it in an interesting way, but like it's still there. Yeah, it's scary stuff.
What's happened there is I accidentally made a really insightful point that was against my own argument.
Oh dear. So there's one final thing that I just want to quickly mention. I don't want to talk about this for too long because it's a really hard topic to talk about. But another area that machine learning is used is in policing, and I think this is particularly dangerous because so it's used to try and identify areas of crime, and it's also used to try and predict crime, like either predict where it will happen or maybe try and predict almost like Minority Report, like trying to predict who will commit crime and stuff like that. And I think it's really, really dangerous.
Do you mind if I spin this up into the least controversial example I can think of? So I'm imagining a system that might be put in place to decide who police are going to stop and breathalyse to check if they're drink driving. And you feed in all this historical data of people who've been caught drink driving. I get the feeling that system might decide that you should never stop a police officer because they're almost certainly not going to be drunk.
Yeah.
And what would then happen based on that is they follow that advice. They never stop a police officer because police officers never drink drive. It's just not a thing that happens. And they're going to do that for a good long time. And then at some point, there's going to be a review of all the data. And that data is going to show that police officers never get caught drink driving. So in future, they're not going to bother stopping police officers. And it's just this whole feedback loop that develops. And if it's decided that, I don't know, people that work in bars, they're way more likely to be drink driving. So you should stop them a lot. And weirdly, after doing that for a year or so, they noticed that in their data, people who work in bars don't half drink drive a lot. We should stop more of them. And the feedback just continues and continues and continues.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. That's like, their bias input resulting in bias output. And the feedback loop. It is interesting.
And it's completely self-confirming.
Yeah. The really sort of terrifying stuff is when it's used to try and predict crime, and like, what do you do with that information? Like, if you have a system that says, so-and-so is likely to commit a crime, like, what do you do? Like, the slightly more wholesome approach would be to sort of try and get in touch with that person and try and, I don't know, have some kind of positive impact on their life to try and reduce the chances of them committing whatever crime it is they're going to commit. But I think for the much more sort of, the pessimist in me feels like what would happen is just either sort of unreasonably and unfairly just like watch them, and then you end up with someone just having police follow them everywhere, which seems like a bad idea, or just detain them based on things that they haven't done, which is, it's a scary thought, and I think we're dangerously close to that kind of stuff. And so again, it's just sort of like, these systems should be used carefully with human oversight and with huge amount of care and attention.
So to wrap all of this up, I've kind of presented a version of this where people are the problem. And I suppose that's kind of what you've done as well, but in perhaps a slightly different set of ways, particularly with your sort of more industry-specific viewpoint on it. Where's the optimistic ending to this?
I don't know. Like, I don't have the answer. I don't think I can sort of say, oh, we should just follow these simple steps and all of a sudden this whole problem will go away. Like, I don't think there is a simple solution to this problem because it's a really complicated problem. But an interesting thing that occurred to me the other day when thinking about this is that my degree in computer hardware and software engineering did not include any modules on ethics or philosophy or any kind of soft skills. Like, the closest I got to soft skills being taught was a module in my second year on management. And I wonder if the degrees that people take in these kinds of high-tech degrees, like engineering degrees and computer science in particular, I feel like there would be value in trying to teach soft skills and teach about ethics. And that's obviously really hard to do, but some kind of education in that and some kind of encouragement to get people to empathise with others, I think would help a great deal in developing systems that have less negative impact on society. And the other obvious one is to try and find ways to improve diversity in high-tech industries, and I have no idea how to solve that problem.
And I have no idea how to sort any of it.
It's a hard problem, but we should still try.
Question is, do you want to redo an outro or use the one from last time?
I'm going to redo an outro. You can find the show notes for this episode at spinnerproof.com/episodes/61, and there you can find links to all the stuff we've been talking about today. You can also find a link to our Twitter at Spinnerproof, where you can tweet to us your favourite electric pickup truck.